preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Levi Darby, although this evening I feel that I should introduce myself as Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. I congratulate you on braving the weather and coming to the 92nd Street Y this evening for the opening of our series entitled The Free Exercise Thereof, Church, State, and Society. This series was developed by us in the Jewish Omnibus program in the 92nd Street Y, in our belief that current issues that you read about in the newspapers, if you follow legal cases involving issues of religion and society, are of the utmost importance to the community at large and specifically to the Jewish community. It was our desire in this series to explore those issues to the fullest. Therefore, we are delighted to have a number of expert speakers both in the religious field and in the legal field to discuss the issues with all of you over the course of this series. This evening, our speakers will be Professor Burt Neuborne, formerly the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and currently professor of law at the New York University Law School. Our second speaker was to be Milton Himmelfarb. Unfortunately, although you were not detained by the weather, Mr. Himmelfarb has been and informed me late this afternoon that he could not be with us this evening. I offer apologies on his behalf and on behalf of the Y. It's unfortunate that he will not be able to be here to present his views, but we hope that in the conversation between Professor Neuborne and our moderator, and through dialogue with you, the audience, that all the views regarding tonight's issue will emerge. Our moderator this evening and for the entire series will be Mr. Theodore Mann. Mr. Mann is a partner in Mann & Unger, a law firm in Philadelphia, and his Jewish communal activities have been wide and varied. Currently, he is president of the American Jewish Congress, formerly was chairperson of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry from 1981 to 1983, Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish major Jewish organizations from 1978 to 1980, and of National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council from 1976 to 1980. This evening we will hear Professor Neuborne discuss the issue of church, state, and the public sector, specifically what has become to be known as the Creche Kvetch, that is to say, the building of creches and menorahs on public lands. And then, of course, in dialogue with Mr. Mann, we expect that the further issues will be articulated. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Burt Neuborne.
Thank you for coming. When I became legal director of the ACLU back in 1982, the last thing that was in my mind was to expend a substantial amount of my energy on Establishment Clause cases, on religion cases. They appeared to me at that time to play a relatively minor role in Supreme Court jurisprudence. They didn't seem to me to be terribly important in terms of public policy. And I confess that in the first year of my term, I resisted quite substantially being drawn into Establishment Clause controversies. Well, I was as right about that as I was about many other political issues in those days. It was the harbinger and the beginning of an extraordinary explosion of constitutional law and public policy in the area of the relationship of church and state. An explosion that manifests itself in a number of different ways. The most visible, I think, in recent years, the use of religious symbols on public property. But an explosion that I think reflects a deeper and much more difficult and much more troublesome issue. And what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about the Creche cases because they're both interesting and highly topical. But to try to relate them to something a good deal deeper, and that is the role that religion and religious values must play or should play or can play or is permitted to play under the Constitution in public life. And let me start by saying that I think that it is impossible, not only bad policy, but impossible to suggest that religion and religious values can be totally excluded from public life. You cannot take a country like this one, in which religion is so embedded in the social structures of the nation, and in which religious values so enormously inform much of our life, and try to make some sort of surgical incision between public life and religious life in a way that completely eliminates religion from public life. Not only would it enormously, it seems to me, impoverish both the moral and ethical discourse that has to underlie much of our public life, but it would just be impossible to cut it out. We are a religious people, as Justice Douglas noted years ago. We approach issues often through the perspective of religious education and religious values, and it is foolish, it seems to me, to even think about a polity that completely excludes religion. Now, having said that, we then have to ask ourselves, what is the appropriate degree to which religious thinking, not necessarily the values that underlie much of the religious tradition of this nation, but religious thinking itself, to what extent should religious thinking enter into the public policy decisions of officials, of elected officials, of appointed officials, and to what extent should they in some way become a component of public policy making? And let me sketch out for you what I perceive these days to be the two warring camps, or the two different points of view about that very difficult question, the relationship between religion and public policy. On the one hand, there are a group of people, well-meaning, I think quite thoughtful people, who say the following, who take a kind of common sense, intuitive approach to the problem. And they say, look, religion is one of the extraordinary gifts that we have in this nation. We have a religious heritage that is a heritage of peaceful relationships between religion and the state, a rich and deep religious heritage, and something which virtually everyone admits exercises a beneficent impact on the way on the way we live. It is perhaps the most civilizing influence that exists in American life. If that's so, they say, then religion is a positive good in the society, and that government, when it thinks about what it should be doing, should treat religion as one of the good things in life that should be encouraged, that should be, in the code word of today's legal jargon, accommodated, that public policy should be made in a way that facilitates religious exercise, that facilitates the financial and organizational health of religious institutions, and that as long as three criteria are met, as long as it's not too expensive, as long as it's not really coercive in the sense that it forces people to do something that they don't want to do, and as long as it doesn't discriminate between and among different types of religion, that there's nothing wrong with an affirmative public policy that favors religion the same way we would favor charity, or the same way we would favor concern for the poor, or the same way we would favor equality. The things that everybody admits, or most everybody admits, are quite good things for government to try to foster. Why shouldn't it foster religion as well? And that's the line of thinking, I take it, that underlies a good deal of the current attempt to rethink some of the old line Establishment Clause cases. It comes up in a number of contexts. It would come up in aid to religious schools. It would come up in the placing of religious symbols in public places. It comes up in having chaplains in legislative settings. It comes up in granting tax deductions and tax benefits to people engaged in activity closely associated with religious settings. And the package that emerges from that type of thinking is a package in which the government would be strictly forbidden to discriminate among religions. In other words, it could not favor one religion over another. But as long as it treated all religions equally, there would be nothing wrong with the government tilting in favor of the concept of religion itself and creating the kind of extraordinarily fertile setting within which religion could flourish. And the argument goes, why shouldn't the Constitution permit, indeed encourage, religious activity like that? Let me put that argument to one side for a moment, because I'll come back to it. It is an argument that has a good deal of common sense, intuitive appeal, especially if you feel, as I do, and I think as many people do, that religion is an extraordinarily positive aspect of life in modern society, and perhaps the only engine in which civilizing impulses are going to be kept alive in a society that is increasingly materialist and increasingly concerned with short-term gratification. So that's one side. That's the accommodationist arguments. Those are the arguments that I argue against all the time. But I think it's important that they be out there and that they be recognized as legitimate positions held by people who sincerely believe them. The other side, the existing law, or at least the law until very recently, and I think the law that will continue to be on the books, says, of course, religion is a good thing. Of course, our society is committed to being a religious society. But the relationship between religion and government is an enormously touchy and difficult relationship. It's like mixing gasoline and fire. Whenever a government gets too close to religion, a conflagration is set off, which creates much more harm than the benefit that you hope will happen from government support or government toleration, if you will, of religion. And it's a strict neutrality that is summed up, I suppose, in the Madisonian notion of a wall, of a separation between church and state, the attempt to build in as far as you possibly can, because remember, I started my remarks by conceding, as I think everyone must, that you cannot eliminate religious values from public life. They're just too ingrained in our society, and they're too important to try to eliminate from public life. But insofar as you possibly can, the old Madisonian notion is that you erect a wall between church and state, and that because you erect that wall between church and state, in a strange way, religion gets treated worse than some of the other aspects of American life that are purely political, and that we have no problem with the government fostering. We have no problem with the government fostering equality. We have no problem with the government fostering concern for the poor. We have no problem with the government fostering education as a value. Those are important values. And yet we have a problem with the government fostering religion. Why should that be so? And let me try for a moment to sketch out for you why I think it's so, why I think it is, in a common sense, non-legal way, important to confront the notion that we're safer by eliminating government support and government assistance to religion. Not because there's anything wrong with religion. Of course there's nothing wrong with religion. It is an extraordinary force in American life. But because a prophylactic approach to the relationship between church and state is simply safer and in the long run far more productive in building the kind of society which has the kind of toleration and the kind of respect that is necessary for the flourishing of a truly religious culture. Think for a moment, if you will. It occurred to me riding up in the subway. The four worst places, or four of the worst places, that you can think of on earth at this point, because it says something about religion's darker side. It's something that we find it very difficult in our cultural memory to really call up, because we've been so enormously fortunate in this country that we've been spared the kinds of violence between religious sects that occurs so often throughout the world. But if you think for a moment of four of the worst places on earth, you think of Northern Ireland, where Catholics are killing Protestants and Protestants are killing Catholics solely because of the church they attend. You think of Beirut, where Muslim kills Muslim and Maronite Christian, and all of them can't wait to get their hands on Jews. And it is a place in which the religion of an individual will create a life and death situation. You think about India, where Hindu kills Muslim, Muslim kills Sikh in a cycle of violence that has lasted for 20 years and shows absolutely no sign of petering out. You think of Iran, where an entire religious sect, the Baha'is, may well have been wiped off the face of the earth in the last 3 years. 900,000 people probably killed just because of their religion. And you realize that there is, to the notion of religion, a terrible potential for harm, as well as an extraordinary source of good. And I think the founders recognized that. And I think what the founders realized was that religion, unlike all of the other forces that operate in public life, is a non-rational force. It's one of the things that makes religion enormously important. But one's religious beliefs are not subject to rational debate. You don't have a cost-benefit analysis. You don't go through a utilitarian notion. You don't let Jeremy Bentham decide whether or not you believe or not. It is something that stems from forces far deeper and far stronger than the forces of human reason. And therefore, it has to be treated very gingerly as a motivating device in human life. It is one of the extraordinary motivating devices in human life. It has the capacity to drive people, but it drives people in non-rational ways. And history tells us that non-rational drive that is created by deeply felt religious belief, that when that non-rational drive gets its hands on secular power, when you link religious belief and secular power, the non-rational drive can't be turned off like a switch. It continues to drive forward in the attempt for the believer to bring reality into accord with something that believer is tremendously attached to at some very deep psychological level, and which is not subject to rational discourse. I take it that explains, or at least it verbally explains, the enormous cost in blood that religion has cost over the years. And the founders recognized that, and they said something. They said, look, recognizing that religion is a non-rational force of enormous power, we like to think in the 20th century that Freud has discovered the mainsprings of behavior. We think, we're very modern, and we think that sex is the key to non-rational behavior. I think the founders recognized something far more profound, and they recognized that religious belief is one of the dynamic mainsprings of human conduct. And as such, it has to be very carefully integrated into a secular society. And that means that religion has to be treated worse than political ideas when the state is somehow involved, but better than political ideas when the individual is involved. And that brings me to my last point, and that's that people often say that there is a collision between the two clauses, between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. That the Establishment Clause says the government can't do things to foster religion, while the Free Exercise Clause guarantees us the right to act in accordance with our religious consciences, and that at some point the two collide. That when the state tries to foster free exercise, all of a sudden it trips over establishment. When the state attempts to abide by the Establishment Clause, somehow it impedes free exercise. That there is a tension between the two. I think that's wrong. I think there is no tension. I think that the tension is drained out of those clauses by recognizing that religion is a non-rational, immensely motivating behavior force. And that means that you go to great lengths, great prophylactic lengths, to say that the state, that a religious individual should never be permitted to use the state to advance the religious beliefs. And that calls for a strong neutrality force that says it isn't whether or not you're going to discriminate among religions that's really important. The real question is, are you tilting toward religion at all? Are you allowing individuals with a deep religious belief to get their hands on the engines of state power. If you are, then you are engaging in this very dangerous equation that's created so much misery in the world, and that we simply can't afford it as a risk. And so a prophylactic establishment clause says, of course it means that we can't foster something that many of us believe deeply in. We can't help religion carry out its mission. But the reason we can't do that, the reason we can't allow the state to help religion to carry out its mission, is that once that linkage is made, once you link a religious person to secular power, then the religious person is driven, and correctly so, driven by his beliefs to attempt to do all he can, all she can, to carry out those beliefs. And the stopping point is very difficult the principal stopping point isn't there at all, because you're not talking about a rational activity. You're talking about a wonderful non-rational activity, but one that nevertheless has to be treated very gingerly because of that. On the other hand, when you're talking about private behavior, when you're talking about the free exercise of religion, doing something because you feel religiously you must, there you treat that better than politics, because you recognize that the truly religious individual has no choice. The role of law in this society is to create a rational stopping point, to tell somebody, look, we've thought about this and we think you can't do that. But you tell that to an Orthodox Jew who's in the army, whose God tells him that he must wear a yarmulke. And no army set of regulations can substitute for that belief. You can't take a utilitarian notion of, well, we've thought about it, and in the long run, it's better for military discipline if people's heads aren't covered indoors. That's not an answer to the deeply felt religious drive that results in an Orthodox Jew wearing a yarmulke while in the service. And so for those situations, it seems to me, very important to treat religion better than politics. You can tell somebody to take off your button. Take off your political button, because it's not a good idea to have political buttons worn in some situation. Maybe we can make a cost-benefit analysis about that. But you don't tell somebody to take off their religious symbol, because that's felt a good deal more deeply, and you know that if it is a truly believing individual, the individual will suffer the pain that the secular state imposes upon him rather than violate his religious conscience. And I think the founders realized that. The founders realized that they were in the presence of a motivating force that was stronger than the forces that ordinarily motivate us to engage in political activity. It was a force that was deeper than politics, and therefore they treated it more gingerly when the state was involved, and better when the individual was involved. Now, by and large, we've lived up to that vision, I think. By and large, the vision has done fairly well. In the last couple of years, there's been an attempt, I think, by well-meaning people to try to loosen the screws a little bit. They've said, gee, we've done so well. Can't we at least try to help religion a little bit? There really isn't very much risk. Let's just have a little bit of mixing of church and state. And as long as we see to it that, as I say, it's not expensive and it's not truly coercive and it doesn't really discriminate among religions, why not try it? And I think the answer is that the reason we've been so lucky as a people doesn't spring from anything innate in the American character. We're not innately better than the English or the Irish. What we have is we have a set of rules that's governed us and that's served us enormously well. What it's told us is, don't start down that road. A little bit of mixing of church and state is the beginning of the erosion of the wall that once it begins to come down, it is impossible to put back up. That's what they've learned in society after society. And so that the notion of separation then becomes tremendously important. One just final word on the Creche cases, as I promised you. I'll bring you up to date. You remember that the litigation over the Creches took place in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I must tell you a very funny story that we sued, I was the legal director at the time, we sued the mayor of Pawtucket for putting up a creche on on the lawn of the City Hall. And the mayor's response was to hold a news conference and to say that the ACLU had sued him, but the reason the ACLU had sued was because there weren't 3 wise men and a virgin in the entire bunch. I awarded him a 1-year exemption from ACLU litigation for wit in at least raising the level of public discourse. But apart from that exchange between us, the lawsuit went on, and as you know, the lower courts declared the creche unconstitutional because they said, look, what could be a more obvious example of the mixing of church and state than for a city to take a religious symbol, a great religious symbol, a symbol of a dynamic faith, and turn that religious symbol into some sort of official celebration. What could be more dramatically out of step with this notion of separation of church and state? And the case went to the Supreme Court, and we were really quite surprised and very troubled when the court reversed the opinion of the lower courts and ruled 5-4 that it was not a violation of the Establishment Clause for a municipality to display a creche in the context of Pawtucket. And the sad part about the Supreme Court's opinion is how they got to where they got. In order to uphold the showing of the creche, the court had to essentially eliminate its religious significance. And so what the court did is the court stressed the fact that the creche was shown alongside of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Santa Claus, a whole host of secular Christmas celebratory symbols, and that essentially it was simply a symbol of the secular holiday and not the religious holiday. We promulgated very quickly after that case what came to be known as the 2 plastic animal rule. The 2 plastic animal rule is that a creche can be shown on a public place, but only if it's surrounded by 2 or more animals, plastic animals of sufficiently bad taste to destroy the truly religious nature of the symbol. And of course, it's a sad irony. The irony is the creche can be shown, but only if it's stripped of what is of the sacred character, of the character that ought to elicit respect and awe and veneration for the symbol of a great religious faith. That the only way that symbol can be shown in public is if it is cheapened to the point where it becomes simply another symbol of commercialized Christmas. Religion doesn't win when the only way that you can show the symbols of religion is to turn them into essentially materialist images of a holiday that's lost its religious roots. And in fact, the interesting thing is that the court has not had a creche case since. It's had a number of opportunities to deal with public creche cases. But the lower courts, to my utter amazement, because the 2 plastic animal rule was promulgated as a joke inside the ACLU simply because I had to keep the spirits up somehow. We were losing so much. So that the courts around the country are now adopting not the 2 plastic animal rule, but they are striking down creches unless the creches are surrounded by a sufficient degree of symbolism to denature them as a religious symbol. And so you have this very complicated notion of when a religious symbol is not a religious symbol. Well, the quagmire that surrounded the creche cases seems to me to simply reinforce my original notion, and that's that the danger of starting down the road at all is enormous. That the betrayal, the sense of betrayal that the plaintiffs in that Pawtucket case felt was really quite extraordinary. Some of the plaintiffs were Jewish, but a number of them were completely secular people that had no religious beliefs. There were several rabbis in the community, several Jewish groups in the community, but a whole spectrum of the Pawtucket society. The sense of betrayal they felt at the end of the case when they were told, essentially, that they were outsiders, tolerated outsiders, welcome guests at the feast, but nevertheless guests at the feast, because the mansion wasn't theirs. And they were invited, They were tolerated, they were treated well, but they damn well better remember that they were guests. And that message went out loud and clear. It goes out every single time a government uses its power to announce that there is a dominant religious faith, and that dominant religious faith has control over the government sufficient to require the government to emblazon the public spaces with that religion's symbol. It is an unfortunate message, because it essentially says to the rest of the community that there is a we-they relationship. And that long-term erosion of the bonds of trust and political equality that have to bond people together in a secular democracy strikes me as being a very serious loss to the society. So that the net result of the Creche cases was no great victory for religion, but a substantial defeat for the notion of a strict notion of a wall of separation of church and state. Interestingly enough, in recent cases involving aid to parochial school and involving silent prayer in the schools, the rhetoric of the strict separation of church and state has come back into vogue. The last few decisions of the Supreme Court have been decisions which have vigorously reasserted the strict separationist model, I think in large part because the court was stunned at the sense of betrayal that the Creche case elicited. It's an interesting observation. I'm not sure that it's true, but in postmortems about the case, many of us thought that the Creche case came out the way it did because there was not a Jewish justice on the court. There was no non-Christian justice on the court who could tell his or her brethren that you don't understand the symbolic impact of what you're doing. And in fact, Justice O'Connor's swing concurrence, it was a 5-4 case, and Sandra Day O'Connor cast the swing vote in favor of the Creche. The opinion was a very sensitive opinion, and she said, I think it would violate the Establishment Clause if it sent a message that said that you're an outsider. And I will never allow those kinds of messages to be sent. And the sad part was that she lacked the empathy to understand that a non-Christian must feel that they are designated as outsiders when a government of which they are supposedly fully equal displays a religious symbol of the dominant religious faith. And so many of us think that the court recoiled from what they feel was a troublesome opinion. Perhaps they went further than they meant to go in the Creche case. And the recent cases indicate a strong resurgence of the strict separationist philosophy and a very dramatic rejection of the attempts by the Reagan administration Justice Department to persuade the court to back off from its tradition of strict separationism. And predictions are very difficult these days with the court. It's so tightly balanced. But my sense is that the strict separationist philosophy is not in danger of being abandoned. I would not have said that 2 or 3 years ago. I would have been much more nervous. But the strict separationist philosophy appears to have survived a very strong attempt by people to turn it back. And I would suspect in the years to come that we'll continue to see that strict separationist philosophy prevail. Thank you.
Burt, before we got to the Creche part of it, the major part of your speech, I think, was an excellent, really introduction to the entire series that we're going to have here, and I'm awfully glad you made it. We're trying to explore in these 4 sessions all corners of what it is we mean by religious liberty in this society. That's why we have 4 programs. Tonight's is just the first. If the 50s and 60s were the time when the courts dealt with religion in the schools, and the 60s and 70s were the time when the court dealt with governmental aid to parochial education, the mid-80s, I think, is the time when the courts are going to be dealing and are now dealing with religious symbols on public property in the city halls of this nation, etc. This is a funny evening for me. I was supposed to be the moderator. Hi. I was supposed to be the moderator. It becomes very difficult to moderate Burt Neuborne.
People have tried.
Yes, nor do I care to. I agree with everything he said, and I disagree with everything Milton Himmelfarb was going to say, and he's not here. Very, very upsetting. And before I came, and when I heard late this afternoon that he wasn't going to be able to make it because of the weather, I sat down to try to sketch a few notes on what Milton Himmelfarb would say, because I know very well what he would say, and maybe that'll come up as we get through the discussion during the course of the evening. Because he isn't here, and because there isn't going to be a real debate, I'm hopeful that we can involve the audience earlier in the evening than we typically do. So in a moment, but not quite yet, please feel free to make your comments, ask your questions, even if it is unfortunately the fact that Burt Neuborne and I apparently agree on everything in this field, except one thing, and this is an opportunity that I don't want to pass up. I've been very upset by the Pawtucket decision for a very long time. I've spoken on it and written on it. But I think the thing I was most upset about was that the ACLU started the lawsuit. So this gives me an opportunity to ask you a question. With all of the courthouses in the United States that have on them at the Christmas season enormous creches, unsurrounded by anything, for weeks before the holiday, on the courthouse, the symbol of government, 5 foot tall, 8 feet wide. You can go to countless numbers of communities throughout the country where that has been so for a long time, sending the very message you're talking about. Why in the world would the ACLU have selected as its first case in this field a case involving a wire strung across the city of Pawtucket that has on it 10 or 15 little symbols, one of which is a creche, and all of the others of which are the other things you see around Christmas time? Why was that the suit you decided to? I started the Bible reading case, Shemp, back in the late 50s. And I was looking for a case that was kind of pure, about which nobody could say, well, but that isn't really religion. I mean, there were Christmas trees in schools to complain about, and Christmas carols in schools to complain about. All of these things, there was a good dispute. Is it religion? Is it culture? Is it so on and so forth? But the Bible, nobody would dare say that the reading of 10 verses from the King James Version of the Bible is anything other than a religious exercise. And I made sure that that was the first suit we started. Why did you start this suit in Pawtucket, and now we all have to climb uphill?
Well, there are two reasons. One, and I don't want to defend the ACLU, but the ACLU doesn't start suits. The ACLU represents people who feels their rights have been violated. The plaintiffs in that suit, which included the organized Jewish community of Pawtucket, felt very deeply and very strongly about this issue. It was not something that you could simply say to them, we're very sorry, but go away, we're looking for a better case. When someone comes into my office, or came into my office, now I'm back in the safe confines of NYU, I don't have to make these decisions anymore, but when someone would come into an ACLU office and say their rights are being violated, I didn't send them away and say, I want to find a better case. By and large, if someone's rights were being violated, my perception of the ACLU was as a hammer to try to protect those rights. I must say I was stunned when, as everyone else was, I think, that the Pawtucket case lost. It won very handily in the district court. One reason why Rhode Island was not a bad place to litigate was that the district judge in Rhode Island is an extraordinarily sympathetic man who made extremely good factual findings. The Supreme Court simply ran over them as they can. If they want to be intellectually dishonest, they can do that. The district judge in Pawtucket, it was tried in Providence, the district judge in Providence made a factual finding that these were religious symbols, that they were intended to be religious symbols, and that the community perceived them as religious symbols. In the face of those three findings of fact by the district judge, the Supreme Court Court invented a new kind of fact, which they called a social fact as opposed to an adjudicative fact, and simply refused to abide by the judge's fact-finding. First Circuit was a good place to litigate it as well. But the real issue is that you often don't sit back. If I sat back and waited for the perfect case, or sat back and waited for the perfect time to bring the perfect case, there are always reasons not to go. My sense is that over the years, the ACLU strategy, at least as long as I've had anything to do with its legal program, has been a very aggressive one. And it's been a strategy that says, if we lose today, we'll win tomorrow. But if we don't win today, but if we don't try today, we certainly are going to lose today. And that sitting back silently simply meant that there would be no protection for the religious rights of the minorities in those communities. So
let me try one.
Played and lost.
Let me try one more question, which I don't believe in, but the last one I did.
Yeah, well, I mean,
now I got to play a role.
It's a reasonable question, especially since we lost.
Now let me play my role. Suppose somebody came into the ACLU 5 years ago before Pawtucket and said, the Christmas tree outside of on public property, paid for by the government, is really bothering me. It makes me feel like a minority. It makes me feel blah, 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 that I'm not in the polity and so on and so forth. Start a suit for me. What would you do?
I wouldn't.
And tell me why.
I wouldn't because it's my sense is, or at least I do a little research, but my instinct is that I wouldn't, because the Christmas tree would not be sufficiently identified in the public eye as a religious symbol. It would be too close to a secular symbol of the holiday, a secularized symbol of the holiday, if you will. And my sense as a lawyer is that it would be almost impossible to win that case. Your sense of the fact that somebody was reading the Bible in school back in Scamp and nobody could say that wasn't religious. My sense was that nobody could say that Jesus and the Virgin Mary and the rest of the creche wasn't a religious symbol. I hadn't realized essentially how far we'd fallen in terms of respect for religious symbols. I mean, it is a stunning thing to say. It really is. Think about the two plastic animal rule for a second, and what a terrible thing it says. That you take one of the great symbols of a religious faith, and you hoke it up with just dreadful imagery, and it ceases to be a meaningful religious event. That's a dreadful thing for the Supreme Court to have said, but they said it.
When I speak to Jewish audiences, I have a lot of difficulty with some members of it drawing the line between creches and Christmas trees, or between creches or between crosses and Santa Claus. How do you draw that line?
It's a hard line. I mean, the line, and it may be an arbitrary line, but the line that I try to draw is the sense that something is widely perceived as the expression of a religious, of a divine revelation in some way. And the cross and the creche are, I think, by anybody's definition of the terms, powerful religious symbols. Santa Claus is a powerful religious symbol as well, but it's a powerful religious symbol of Mammon, not of Christ. And so it really is not a religious symbol.
I come out the same way. I think I approach it from the other end. I look at it from the point of view of what kind of symbolism can a Jew internalize and still remain a Jew. Mm-hmm. And that a Jew can internalize a Christmas tree and Santa Claus and the reindeer and have no trouble remaining a Jew, but cannot accept as a symbol for himself in any way at all a creche, the visible symbol of a divine being born.
No, I think that's
remain Jewish.
That's an excellent way to look at it. I mean, it really is a very good way to do it. I might also say that in terms of my own personal belief, I didn't when I was legal director, and I don't now, encourage these suits. It seems to me that these suits are suits that you bring if a plaintiff genuinely feels the sense of exclusion that requires some attempt at redress, but that one ought not to reach out if the sense of outrage isn't felt in the local community, it is not a good idea to foment the sense of outrage. These suits in the long run are very divisive suits. Even when you win, they're very divisive suits. And the society pays a price for bringing into the public eye the divisions that exist among
the price is worth it only, I think, if you think there's a good shot that at the end of the road there is going to be a new Supreme Court decision that's the law of the land, which in itself becomes a symbol, which is a very important symbol for all Americans and the diversity of America. I think the audience ought to know that there are a host of Creche and Menorah, I haven't asked you anything about Menorahs yet, cases pending in the courts today, and there weren't 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, this is a whole new thing. I don't know all of them.
With just unbelievably technical distinctions. This one is 8 foot 7 inches high, so it's all right. This one is 3 foot 4 inches high, so it's all right.
I don't know what happened to the Birmingham, Michigan case where it's at, but it was won. It was a Creche case. There's a case in Chicago that was lost that's on its way up. That is an important case with a creche inside of the City Hall of Chicago. There is a case out in Los Angeles that's wending its way through the courts, and I don't know where else. And the Menorah situation is really brand new. I don't think there was a Menorah case before 3 years ago.
Well,
I used to go around the country talking to Jewish audiences after having tried to get the Lubavitch movement to please stop putting up menorahs on public property, urging them, in Philadelphia, for example, where they have an enormous menorah on in Independence Mall, which is government, if there ever was, in front of Independence Hall. And right across the street from Independence Mall is the Jewish Museum, a beautiful area, private property, owned by the Jewish community. And I urged them to please put it across the street. They would not hear of it, and then they went to Washington at Lafayette Square, and now all over the United States. And I had been urging Jewish communities for a good 10 years now that it's got to really be stopped, and they ought to be starting suits. And Jewish community leaders, although they agreed with the church-state position, were so frightened about the idea of suing the Lubavitch and being accused of doing something divisive within the Jewish community. But we've gotten over that, and for the last 2 or 3 years, these suits are now pending. We will see how they go. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I mean, the Menorah cases there are two aspects to them. One aspect is an equality aspect. A number of people have said to me, look, if we're going to lose on the creches, then at least let's have an equal use of government facilities, and we'll take advantage of this notion that says that as long as you don't discriminate among religions, then somehow this tilt toward religion should be permitted.
Think of menorah with 2 animals.
That's right. That's right. Of course, in the long run, what that's going to do is
not a pig.
Yeah, I was going to say it's going to flesh out every possible religious cult that's going to want its symbol shown on its day, and then right behind them, I know it because I can hear them beginning to organize already. Are there political movements that are going to say, okay, well that's fine. You can have the menorah tomorrow, though we want a swastika on the same place where we showed the menorah, because you can't discriminate among symbols. You can't, it's all equal. And sure enough, they're going to be there. I mean, some bright person will realize that he's going to get some sort of publicity for his movement by doing that, and it's one of the unfortunate aspects of the Creche case that it created the explosion of a kind of jockeying for who's going to get the best use of the public facilities, so that they can feel that they've somehow put one over on their opponents, and it does not make for the kind of harmonious relationship between religious groups that characterized American life.
But I can tell you, Burt, that if in fact the Supreme Court decides that a creche in City Hall, unadorned by anything else, is valid and constitutional, I think I would join those who would go for the menorah.
Of course.
Right, okay. So
Sure.
just so we understand
You
that.
simply can't. I mean, that's the sad part about it. Everybody is drawn into it, whether you want to
That's right.
or not.
That's
I
right.
mean, people who would be delighted to keep religion a private thing, which is what it should be. I mean, my goodness, religious organizations in this country are extraordinarily fortunate and powerful and able to foster a religious belief without the need of using the government, thank goodness. And to be involuntarily drawn into this as a competitive thing is a dreadful thing. And yet we're on the verge of something like that happening.
Let me be Milton Himmelfarb and ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
I think he would ask, can a nation endure, remain unified, without national symbols that transcend material things? Can free enterprise really be the symbol of America and over the long haul hold Americans together? Don't we need these kinds of symbols?
I would answer. Milton has asked me that question on platforms.
There you go.
And it's a good question. I must say, I'm sure the only way to ever beat him in a debate is to have him be unable to be here because of a snowstorm. The answer, I think, is an answer that I try to turn back on him. He says, can a nation remain united? I say, can a nation dare adopt some sort of religious symbols as supposedly its unifying characteristic? I know of nothing that will drive wedges between people faster than competition over whose religious symbol is going to be the symbol that triumphs. That's a road that is calculated, I think, to leave us in shreds as far as unity goes. But his point is a well-taken point, and that's that you cannot have Santa Claus as the symbol of an enduring society. The cash register is not going to be the thing that holds us together, and it's certainly not the thing we want to bequeath our children. So that, but the only symbols that transcend materialism are not religious symbols. I mean, I take it what we care about this country about are a whole host of values that, of course, trace their ultimate derivation to religion, but which are truly secular values in the 20th century. Values of autonomy and rationality and individualism and equality and compassion and caring. Lord knows there are enough symbols of that without having to go to an overtly religious symbolism to
I use the line sometimes that religion is good, as you say, and government is good. It's only the connection that's bad, and the brilliance of the First Amendment was that it simply cut the cord. It severed the connection.
Yeah, I mean,
it was essential to do so.
There's a kind of psychological block that many people have in this country when they think about religion. The only two religions that have been persecuted in a sustained way in the United States are Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. They've suffered serious persecution. The Catholics have suffered their shares of shocks, and the Jews have suffered their shares of shocks. But in terms of a sustained persecution, only the Jehovah's Witnesses and only the Mormons. So we don't really have a cultural memory of religious persecution. And so we tend to forget how easy it is to drift into religious persecution. And we tend to think of religious persecution as something fanatical societies that we don't really think of as 20th century societies inflict on each other. We think about Beirut, we think about Iran, we think about India, and we have a cultural distancing of ourselves from them. We say, oh yes, but we've passed through those stages and it can't happen to us. Well, England and Ireland are as close culturally to the background that we all share as you can expect. And they have been unable to solve their problems in large part because there is no legal mechanism that allows them to work out the relationship of religion to the state in Northern Ireland short of power. And they wind up killing each other over it. To drift down that road, to think that we're somehow immune because we're Westerners, because we wear trousers from that kind of stuff, is, I think, really a form of terrible short-sightedness.
Next Himmelfarb question. If anybody else has Himmelfarb questions, raise your hand. Can it be said that the new strength of the religious right is really a reflection of the anger that we ourselves created among Christians when we urged courts to invalidate their symbols in the schools? Do they feel cut off Do they feel that they're without?
Well, they feel, those members of the religious right who speak to me, and there are some, there are some that won't, but there are many who are very thoughtful and anxious to exchange opinions. They articulate a sense of outrage at being denied their capacity to express themselves religiously. They say that it's very important for them to be able to do these things, and that somehow this very small minority has stopped the vast bulk of the population from doing what it wants to do. In fact, one of the most articulate and thoughtful of the religious right spokesmen said to me once that the largest censoring force in the United States was the combination of the Jewish community and the ACLU. Because what we were essentially doing is censoring the public behavior of large numbers of people who wish to engage in religious activities, and we were stopping them from doing so. And that rankles. There is a sense of
You answered, I suppose, that it's the First Amendment.
Well,
that's the real sense.
What I attempted to, what I attempted to answer was that that's exactly why, because they so deeply wish to have their religious beliefs acted out on the public stage, and short of some sort of checking mechanism like the First Amendment, they would undoubtedly do it. That's exactly why. The First Amendment hurts. It hurts me when I hear a Nazi talk. It hurts me when lots of things get done. I hate sexist literature. I hate pornography. And yet there are costs that you pay in a society for having a fundamental principled protections of certain rights that prevent the erosion of those rights. And the cost to the religious majority is that they have to take their religion and exercise it and enjoy it privately. They can't trot it out on the public stage. And that's not a terrible cost to ask them to bear.
I think it's time for the audience to get involved. Yes, sir. Do you have a watch, Burt?
Yeah, sure.
Can you put it down?
Sure.
I'd appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Will I get it back then?
Yeah, no, just put it. I won't touch it. Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is George Paul. I have to question the definition of the problem of Catholics and Protestants slaughtering each other in Ireland. It is true that the division is largely a religious one. It is true that the antagonism has by now developed into a religious antagonism. But the reason they are slaughtering each other, the historical background, as I know it from history, is not religious as such. It is just the fact that the group of Britishers, largely Scotsmen in fact, who invaded Ireland and took over vast parts of Northern Ireland territory and managed to practically enslave economically the original Irish population, which was basically Catholic, have thereby created a feeling of enslavement, a feeling of deprivation of the original inhabitants of Ireland. And it is just, I believe, an unfortunate, how shall I say, byline of history that the one group was Catholic and the other one was Protestant.
But
it would probably be less antagonistic if the religion didn't gradually get up to it. But the reason for the slaughter, the background of the slaughter, is not religious per se. The religion is just a byline.
well, that's a thoughtful criticism, and I accept it. Except I ask you to think for a moment. History is full of situations where conquerors have come and taken over some area. I mean, the whole history of man is the history of conquest.
Or for that matter, blacks in America.
And over time, the conquerors and the conquered somehow reknit themselves into a new society. The fact that the conquerors in Ireland happened to be Protestant and the conquered happened to be Catholic may have been the tinder that set off the original explosion, but what's made it impossible to knit that society into anything remotely resembling a modern state is the fact that both groups want control of the government, and they want control of the government in the name of their religious identities. It isn't just a Marxist struggle between the master class and the underclass in Ireland. If that's all it was, hopefully there'd be ways to resolve that kind of economic tension over time. But the antagonism that divides those people is partly economic, but unfortunately now it's dominantly religious.
Burt, you
No, but that's fair. You're right. You're right that it started as something that wasn't religious and then developed into something that was.
When you mentioned the 4 places that you mentioned, you didn't mention Israel. In terms of Orthodox and non-Orthodox in Israel, a very, very severe and increasingly severe problem.
Well, I mean, as people who care deeply about Israel, it strikes me that Israel is going to pay the price, is now paying the price, and who knows what that price is going to be in the future, of lacking some sort of legal means by which these antagonisms can be turned back. More and more, I think back to the original decision not to use a written constitution in Israel. The original decision to use only
there wasn't much time.
Yeah, there wasn't time, and there was also even then what I think may have stopped the drafting of a written constitution and a Bill of Rights was the concern over whether they could themselves agree on what the religion clauses should say. It was a tremendously difficult thing, and they punted. They punted with a series of organic laws that essentially leave them now with a very difficult problem and no mechanism to work it out. You know, even when we lose an Establishment Clause case, even when we come out on the wrong end of what we think is a free exercise or an Establishment Clause case, we still have this remarkable process that allows us to take the issue out of the political arena and at least emotionalize it a little bit by translating it into law. Now, we all know that law and politics merge in a way that makes it very arbitrary to distinguish the two. But the genius of our process is that it takes a divisive issue that if you try to deal with it in the political sense, through Parliament, that's what Israel is dealing with now, tears you apart and at least gives you a forum to drop it into that allows you to resolve it in a less divisive way.
Identify yourself, please.
Professor Neuborne, that there is such a comedy of interest between the Jewish community and the American Civil Liberties Union. I probably would not make mention of this, and it may be out of order, Ted. But there is a case that was decided in favor of the American Civil Liberties Union client, and the argument against which we promulgated was that it does not protect the religious rights of minorities. I speak of the Wilder-Bernstein case, which you may or may not have heard of.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm afraid I was the lawyer.
Our argument is exactly that. The religious rights of a very small minority, 3.5% of the population, with the judgment that the judge gave, are not protected.
Well, I'll comment on it if you like. I had
Please.
May I very briefly state the issues? Because I'm not sure that people...
It's not easy to do it shortly, but do it briefly.
I'll try to do it quickly. The Wilder case was a challenge to the foster parent procedures in New York City, pursuant to which, as a historical accident really, the foster parent programs and the programs for troubled children in New York City tend to be run in large part by religious denominations. They were very large Catholic groups, at the turn of the century, very large Protestant groups, and a much smaller but very significant Jewish group. And when they were funded privately, they tended to serve their own children. The Catholics served the Catholic kids, the Jews served the Jewish kids, and the Protestants served the Protestant kids. After the Second World War, when the social needs of the city became so tremendously more expensive, it became impossible for the religious institutions to continue funding these agencies out of their own pocket. And so they began to accept increasing amounts of government funds, to the point where approximately 70% of the operational budget of the foster care and troubled children operations is now government supplied. The ACLU challenged that, saying, look, if you're going to take 70 cents on the dollar from the government treasury, then you have to operate yourselves as though you were government agencies. And as government agencies, you can't discriminate on the basis of religion. You can't discriminate on the basis of race, and you must provide first-come, first-served services to all children in need without making any differentiations as to whether they are religious or not. Let me say I hope there are no villains in the Wilder case. What troubled me most about the system was that the Protestant denominations in the city of New York collapsed in terms of their capacity to support their own church units.
Unrelated to the decision.
Oh, yeah. They collapsed somewhere in the 30s.
Right.
The Protestant money dried up. So the Protestant agencies were starved agencies. They were agencies that could provide care that didn't even begin to reach the quality that the Jewish agencies could, and that the best Catholic agencies could provide. And that a disproportionate number of Protestant children needing care in this city are black. So the de facto effect, nobody wanted this to happen, nobody sat up nights planning this, but the de facto effect of it was that the black Protestant kids were being channeled, not because people wanted them to be channeled, but because they were just being channeled into the Protestant agencies that were low-quality agencies. And Jewish and Catholic kids tended to get a better crack. And the Jewish and Catholic kids tended to be, at least the Jewish kids were white, and the predominant of the Catholic kids were white, although there were a substantial Hispanic population as well now. The suit was brought for one reason, and that was to require equalized care. That the care that was to be given to the troubled child population of the city of New York not vary depending upon whether the child was Jewish, was Catholic, was black, was white, or was Protestant. That it just be random, first come, first served to the best agencies. Now, that's very difficult, and I understand that because 30% of the operational budgets still come from the religious institutions, especially in the Jewish agencies. The Jewish community supports them with a very substantial amount of private money. That's why they're the flagship agencies. They are still, the quality of care that they provide is stunningly better. Stunningly better.
What percentage of the Jewish agencies serve, to what degree do they serve Jews, and to what degree do they serve others?
20% Jews and about
80% others.
Right.
But essentially it meant that any Jewish child in trouble could get into a terrific agency, whereas the other.
May I, Burt? I'm trying to figure out where in this four-session thing
fit?
This would fit, and I think it does fit in the third session. Church, state, and government really doesn't fit on symbol. I think Peggy knew when she asked the question.
The American Civil Liberties Union and the Jewish population having a comedy of interest.
Well.
Protection for the religious rights of minorities.
Well, I just want to make clear, now the audience has learned something about a very, very major decision. I think it ought to know that the American Jewish Congress, which normally is on the side of the ACLU in all of these cases, is opposed to the ACLU in this case, very much in favor of the federations, and as a matter of fact, has developed a whole task force report on the subject of just what should the rules be in this kind of relationship. But this is not the night to discuss it. Wait a second, there was a hand back there. Identify yourself, please.
When I think of America, I think of perhaps the Statue of Liberty. To me, that means freedom. And I'm sort of very astounded that nowhere in this discussion, and I've only heard the side of the argument that I thought would please me, I haven't heard anything about what I consider the backbone of America, and that could represent the symbol of America, not a cross and not a star, but no symbols, no religious symbols. Because to me, it's about freedom, and freedom means no religion. If you want to do that religious act in your home, well, fine. But you started with the premise that religion is good. I won't get into whether that's right or not, because you covered yourself by pointing out the ways that perhaps it isn't so wonderful. But the fact is that I always believed, and maybe it was what I wanted to believe rather than the history, that what we were all about was the freedom not to believe or to believe. And that really is the backbone of America.
Let me.
And I'm interested that didn't come up. I mean, it doesn't seem to be represented.
I think we would both 100% agree with what you just said, except your comments about questioning whether religion is good or not. Let me say that when a few months ago, when was it that we celebrated the Statue of Liberty in New York, and I couldn't get it off my television set. I really began to believe, because the Statue of Liberty was really being sold. It was being sold commercially, and maybe that's the way it works in America. Maybe that's the only way to sell it. I thought for the first time, maybe the Statue of Liberty, which to me is the symbol, which to Jews generally is the symbol that's most important to them, but probably is not across the land, that maybe it's beginning to be, maybe it's pluralism that somehow can be sold to Americans as what the national symbol ought to be. Mm-hmm. But it ain't easy, and that's all I'll say. Yes?
Look. It's not easy if the ACLU position doesn't encompass that. I mean, I didn't hear that.
Well, you can't bring a lawsuit to make the Statue of Liberty the symbol of the land.
Well,
you can only
let me say that
oppose a crash.
I didn't think it was possible for me to lose a debate with Milton Himmelfarb with Milton not here, but apparently I mean, that's extraordinary. But let me, perhaps I speak in elliptical jargon. There is the strict separationist philosophy is exactly the philosophy that you describe, that there cannot be a mixing of church and state ever under any circumstances, and that the concession that one makes to religion is simply to try to assure that people understand that when you assert a strict separationist philosophy, it's not out of hostility to religion, but out of respect for it. That's a very important point to get across, because deeply religious people who feel that somehow they're being stopped from doing something will react very strongly and think that the censor is hostile to religion, unless one can explain why that's so. And so you're right in saying that we ought to have only secular symbols, but we oughtn't to couch the argument, I think, in a way that is affirmatively hostile to religion.
Yes, sir, front row.
How would you respond if you were still working with the ACLU and a member or head of an atheist organization came? I don't know, perhaps this has happened.
Everything, at least twice.
It's happened.
Indicated that they were very upset about the In God We Trust being all sorts of things, and chaplains introduce sessions of Congress and so forth. What would be your...
Well, let me summarize for you some of the things. I mean, I lost the chaplain case. I was rather surprised, actually, that again, that was lost. Nebraska has a unicameral legislature, and they've had a Presbyterian chaplain from time immemorial, and he gets paid. He gets paid. I learned, by the way, that the true pay is that you get tickets to the Nebraska football games. That's the real reason you want to be chaplain. But he gets paid something, nominal amount of money, and he is designated Nebraska state chaplain. He's got an office. He's got a. In my naivete, I thought that was an establishment of religion. I said, I may have been wrong in thinking that Jesus and Joseph were a religious symbol, but I know a Presbyterian minister when I see one. And so we brought that suit. And the Supreme Court's response to that suit was to carve out a very narrow and very interesting historical exception. And the historical exception runs something like this. The First Continental Congress, of which Madison was a member, and he was the chairman of the Finance Committee of the First Continental, actually it was the Third Continental Congress, but it was the first Congress sitting under the Constitution. Madison was the chair of the Finance Committee, and he voted affirmatively in favor of funds for the chaplain of the Congress. Therefore, the Supreme Court said the founders wanted to have a narrow historical exception for chaplains in legislative settings, so long as the chaplains were non-denominational, as long as it was just a kind of general assertion of religion. Now, what the court didn't say is that in 1825, Madison said it was the worst thing he'd ever done. He was very sorry that he'd ever done it. He did it because he was afraid of offending his constituents.
Yeah, but he was an old man then.
And of course, it's the difference between trusting politicians to enforce the Constitution and trusting judges. It's why we have the Constitution enforced by judges who don't have to be reelected.
I've turned down those kind of cases too, long time ago, and I think with reason, basically because if you're convinced that there's no chance to win it, that's a good enough reason. It's not the question of whether the person is an atheist or not an atheist, but as Burt mentioned, history is, at least Bible reading was only about 50 years old. Some of these things are 200 years old, and they started at the time the country started and before. And that is a very hard thing to overcome. I argued the Orthodox Jewish blue law cases before the United States Supreme Court in the early 1960s. I remember like it was yesterday. I'm arguing that blue laws are unconstitutional, and Justice Frankfurter is sitting there with the blue law legislation that passed the very year that the First Amendment came into effect. And he said, well, what have you got to say about that? And it's kind of tough to overcome history. It really is. That's why, for example, tax exemption for churches have been held constitutional, even though they're an obviously enormous benefit to churches, because that's always been so. And they don't like to tinker with history too much.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And I think the In God We Trust cases, the Supreme Court begins its session with the crier standing up and saying, God save this honorable court. Every time I argue an Establishment Clause case up there, my heart sinks when the guy stands up and says, God save this honorable court.
Just one funny little story. Because I was reminded of it the other day. In 1973, I was arguing Lemon versus Sloan, a parochial school aid case before the United States Supreme Court, and they scheduled it on the first day of Passover. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to argue a case on the first day of Passover. First of all, I was doing so for a Jewish agency, and I would have been crucified. You should pardon the expression. So I wrote, and Leo Pfeffer, most of you probably know who he is, was also arguing a case that same day. And he and I talked to each other, and we said, we can't argue this on the first day of Passover. But how do we tell the court, without asking them to accommodate religion, that they should change the day? Well, we managed. We wrote a letter to the Chief Justice, and it shows you they're so well-intentioned, like Sandra Day O'Connor. Chief Justice Berger was so well-intentioned, but he didn't understand. He rescheduled it for the day before Passover, in other words, the night of the Seder. And at that point, we just stopped complaining, and we went and argued it. There were a lot of hands up. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Well, I think,
sure.
Yes,
sure.
it is.
I mean, I think...
And we're challenging some of that all over the country today.
I mean, analytically, there's a difference, and I think it's important to keep the difference in mind because the two cases are slightly different. It's one thing for the government itself to sponsor the religious symbol. That's what happened in Pawtucket. That seems to me to be the worst kind of expression of religious symbolism because it is so clearly the government stating a preference for a particular religion. It is slightly less offensive, I think, but nevertheless very troublesome when a private group seeks to use public land to display a symbol and says that all they want is the same right to use that public land as any other political group would have. In other words, if you can hold up a Vote for Democrats sign, the argument is, why can't you hold up a cross, or why can't you hold up a menorah? At least
you can cut it another way. To me, there's a big difference between a creche or a menorah at the seat of government in City Hall or in the county courthouse, a place that everybody associates with government on the one hand, and a creche or a menorah or other religious symbol in a public park. It may be a public park, but it's a public park in which people are allowed to speak and express their views.
A privately owned.
I'm talking about privately owned creche or a menorah in a public park. There the issue comes to be a freedom of expression thing. You're allowed to go to a public park and express your views like everybody else, and you're obviously allowed to express your religious views, and you're allowed to do so through symbols. It's another question, however, of whether you're allowed to go plant your symbol and walk away for 8 days and insist that it stay up there. So you got all of these shadings, and each of these cases involves a different fact pattern, and the law will surely develop in the next few years. Hands. Yes, ma'am. You are. Before you start, this comes back to the first question I asked you, because that's what troubles me. What she was saying was that a reasonable person, a non-paranoid person, would not feel that this, I mean, everybody can be oversensitive and think that something offends them. She was saying that, like a reasonable man in tort law, a reasonable Jew would not think that this excludes him from government. And I must tell you, I think there's something to what she said. Even though your Jewish clients or non-Jewish clients, whoever they were that came into you from Pawtucket, said that they were offended and they felt excluded by it, when I consider, again, a symbol strung up across the city wires of 10 different Christmas symbols, only one of which is the creche, to me it just gives me altogether different feelings from whether government is intending to stick it to me or not than the creche on City Hall or in the county courthouse. And I would have said to that potential client, maybe you're reasonable in your feelings and maybe you're not. But we, the ACLU, have an obligation to win cases. And in so doing, let's go out and find the right one. And now answer her question.
Well, I'll answer them both. First of all, you're misdescribing the creche, Ted. It's not just a bunch of wires with some small things hanging on it. The Pawtucket creche was 15 feet long and 8 feet high. It was a very, very large creche, a creche that screamed out, "I am a creche." It was not something you could ignore, and it was quite reasonable for people to feel that it was the expression of a strong religious attachment. And the mayor made no bones about it. I mean, he said, of course, that's what it's for. It's to put Christ back in Christmas. He said it himself. I think it was quite reasonable for people to feel excluded. You deal with Sandra Day O'Connor two ways. One, you recognize her for what she is, and I think that she is a well-meaning person who simply had a limited experiential background. She just didn't have much experience with religious minorities and much experience with issues like this. She was the minority leader of the Arizona legislature before she was appointed an intermediate appeals judge in Arizona. Nobody had ever heard of her before she burst on the scene as a Supreme Court justice. And she has, in the context of this discussion, a relatively parochial background. You educate her. This is an educable person. She is smart, she's decent, she cares about the issues, and she's been badly shaken by the response to the Creche case. And her Establishment Clause votes since the Creche case have been interesting votes. I mean, she is by no means a lost cause in terms of education. One of the functions of education of litigation is to educate judges. Judges had to be taught about the realities of segregation. That's the way those cases were won. They were won over a long period of time, where you changed the perception of the dominant elite in the society and made them see things through the eyes of the weak for a change. And that's what you have to do with somebody like O'Connor. And the second thing is that you have to be very aggressive and very vigorous and not give an inch on the other issues. I think that's what I hope is happening now. The real danger is that the 5 members of the Supreme Court are over 75 years old, and the voting patterns on the court are very, very tightly balanced. The 4 dissenters in the Creche case, the 4 people that went our way in the Creche case, 3 of them are over 75. Stevens is the only one who was a relatively young man. The balance of power, the real danger is not what the current court is going to do. The current court is holding firm. The real danger,
and they've got 2 years to go.
That's right. When somebody asks me what the role of the ACLU legal staff is these days,
keep them alive.
I say we stay outside the Supreme Court with umbrellas, with rubbers, and with hot soup, and that's our major function. There are some wonderful stories. Justice Marshall is alleged to have told his clerks that if he dies while Reagan is in office, they're to prop him up and keep voting until somebody finds out.
Yes, wait. Is there anybody else before I call on somebody a second time? No, that's you. Go ahead.
Follow up the same point, because this is a question asked in innocence. When you talk about O'Connor, I'm trying to put my mind into the mind of these other judges, and I can't tell whether they're using their finding as an excuse to introduce the kind of life that they would like to see in America, or in fact they're really trying their best to see it from all, because it seems so flimsy to me, and you made a joke of it, the animals and so on. So I'd like to know your real opinion about whether it's that they intend to go forward in the way they intend to go forward, and they'll use whatever finding. You said they walk right over obviously correct facts.
My true opinion on it is that you can't say. You can't generalize as to the court as a whole. If you ask me what I think about Sandra Day O'Connor and Lewis Powell, who are the center of the court, they hold the balance of power in the court.
They have integrity.
They are intellectually honest, extraordinarily decent people trying to do an impossible job because they don't have a strongly felt ideology. So they don't get up in the morning and know which way they're supposed to go. They really are thinking through these problems as pragmatists, and it's a hard thing to be a pragmatist in a world where everybody else knows the answers but you. And so they I think are intellectually honest. I think Berger, I think Rehnquist, and I think to some degree White. Who were the other 3 members of that majority?
Know where they're going when they get up in the morning.
They have a vision about religion and no, I won't even say religion. They have a vision about Christianity and it's the divine providence that has made America a Christian nation. And I think that they deeply feel it. And I think both, maybe White is unfair to say about White, but I think Berger and Rehnquist certainly would push us that way. Now, Berger, of course, is gone. He resigned, and he was replaced by Justice Scalia. Now, we don't know what Scalia is going to do. We know that he was a professor at the University of Chicago. He's intellectually an extraordinary figure, probably the brightest person to sit on the court in some time. He had a strong conservative bent and a strong conservative voting record, but it really means that he feels that the judiciary should have a relatively restrained impact on American life, and we don't know what he's going to do in terms of the religion clauses. He is a devoutly religious man. Devoutly religious Catholic, and it remains to be seen. My own bet is that he'll be a very strong free exercise vote. That he'll understand when somebody says, I had to do this because of religion. And in fact, Scalia on the D.C. Court of Appeals, before he was promoted to the Supreme Court, Scalia voted in favor of the Jewish, or the Orthodox Jew who felt he had to wear his yarmulke while he was on duty. And the irony is, the only case that would have come out different last year if Scalia replaces Berger is that Yarmulke case. We lost that Yarmulke case 5-4 in the Supreme Court with Berger casting a deciding vote. And if Scalia replaces Berger, we win that case 5-4. So it's very interesting.
I agree with Burt's analysis of the personalities, man for man, 100%. And I think it answered your question. I'm going to allow one more question and then call this. You've already asked. You haven't.
We haven't really heard what Milton Himmelfarb would say.
I think that he would, well, Burt, you can answer it too. I think that he would not want creches in the courthouse. He would not want Jewish organizations, however, challenging them. Well, there are other organizations to challenge him, the ACLU, but he would not be in favor of the Jewish community challenging something like that. I shouldn't, this isn't fair. He isn't here. I can only surmise how he feels. But
I also think that what Milton would say if he were here is, don't be so timid about the slippery slope. He would say most of my arguments on the Establishment Clause are, if we start down the road this little teeny bit, when we wake up, we're going to be in Iran. Milton would say to you, it's a long, long way from here to Iran. And that we can afford a fair amount of experimentation and flexibility at the margin without falling over the waterfall. And that perhaps I'm being a bit using scare tactics when scare tactics are not intellectually honest. I think that would be the thrust of his position. And I just think we read history differently. I mean, I think that I think he thinks the genie can be let out of the bottle a little bit and put back in, and I think once it's out of the bottle, there's no controlling it.
You would say that also to the basis of that would be that to do that is to be so frightened about the secret, so is in the process antagonizing the majority.
well, he would, I think, certainly say that.
And
Yeah.
best that things are going well enough, don't mess around.
Yeah, and let me just comment. He would say that, and what I would say to him is that I remember the 50s when Jewish organizations specifically, as well as the ACLU, moved against the Protestant community of America to get their religion out of the public schools, and in the 60s moved against the Catholic community of America to get the government to stop funding their parochial schools. And we caught all kinds of hell, not only from the Milton Himmelfarbs of this world, but from Federation leadership in every community around the United States that's supposed to fund us, saying, you guys are supposed to be making friends for the Jews, and instead you're making enemies for the Jews, and they're going to become anti-Semites. And I must tell you, through this entire period of time when we offended Protestant America and Catholic America, every major study of what has happened to anti-Semitism in the last 40 years in the United States indicates that year by year, it goes up and down, but the general trend has been down through it all. So that I think in the end, if you stand up for your rights and you're sincere about it and you have a good argument, I had swastikas on my house and everything else by getting into this kind of litigation, but over the years, those things are rapidly forgotten, and I think we're all better off as a Jewish community and as a nation.
But the point is a very important point, and that's that it is, in the long run, a serious mistake to count on courts to be the only organ to enforce this. I mean, if the only way that you can enforce religious freedom in America is to continually say to the majority, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, there comes some point at which the majority stands up and says, to hell with all these courts, and sweeps them away.
And the majority can amend the Constitution.
And that's of course Mises' position. He's trying to fan that latent sense of hostility, which is why education is so tremendously important. The arguments in favor of religious tolerance and the arguments in favor of the policies underlying the Establishment Clause are enormous. They're so powerful if you could get them out to the population at large. And one of the problems has been that civil rights in this country has tended to be the province of lawyers, and lawyers have tended to feel most comfortable bringing lawsuits. But if you win an Establishment Clause issue in a city council or in a school board instead of a court, you've done something so much more enduring than necessarily to protect the principle. You've educated a community in civics, and that's a terribly important thing to do. And I think that's why it is very important sometimes to tell people, don't start fights like this when you think that you can win them politically in a couple of years. Do that instead of winning it in court tomorrow. That in the long run is more important.
I want to thank Burt Neuborne for an excellent presentation. I want to thank you lovely people for coming out on such a terrible night.
Yes, thank you very much.
I hope you come out to the succeeding ones when the weather's going to be magnificent. There'll be stars in the sky and it'll be 70 degrees. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.